Hi there, and welcome to The Daily Gardener, a podcast about gardening, botanical history, and literature. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling, and today is October 11th. Today in botanical history, we celebrate a Philadelphia plant lover who we get to know only through his correspondence to other botanists. We'll also learn about the German palm expert and the man who became a director at Kew, but not before he became an expert in the graves of the fallen during World War I. We'll hear an excerpt from the amateur gardener, Helena Rutherford Ely. And we grow that garden library today with a book from one of my favorite modern garden experts, Robert Couric. And I remember speaking with him in my other podcast called Still Growing. He'd written a book called Understanding Roots, and he really did help me understand them. And I see them in a whole different way still today. But he's got this other book that I think you'll like just as well. So I wanted to recommend that today. And then we'll wrap things up with Thai, the Buddhist monk, writer, and peace activist. And I'll also add naturalist to his list of titles because he draws so much insight from nature, as should we all. Well, I thought I'd start out today's show with a little quote that I found from Henry David Thoreau that made me smile. He once wrote, "I would rather sit on a pumpkin and have it all to myself than be crowded on a velvet cushion." Wise words. Well, up at the cabin, as I mentioned a few episodes ago, I think late in September, I managed to discover that we have a pumpkin farm that's about a mile away from our cabin. Never knew it was there all through the pandemic. Never knew that an apple orchard was right next door as well. I just went by the pumpkin patch this weekend and oh my gosh, it was totally packed. You couldn't have found a place to park. It was just nonstop cars. So I'm so glad that I went early. And I'm loving the two pumpkins that I have up on the steps of the front porch up at the cabin. So I only have two pumpkins up there, but these two have tons of personality. And I call one of them Big Bertha because she's this perfectly round, huge orange pumpkin. Truly the roundest, biggest pumpkin I've ever had. So I've got Big Bertha, and then the other pumpkin I call the Brain. And this is a pumpkin that kind of looks like, almost like it's got a cantaloupe or peanuts for an outer layer. And when I was talking to the woman about this particular type of pumpkin, she said that it was supposed to have that effect. And then you were supposed to see orange in between that. But not on this one. It just looks like a big brain. So I've got Big Bertha and the Brain sitting on the front porch as before I go into the cabin. And I love the two of them together. They're so different and they're so unique. And it's just something I'll always remember my fall of 2021, Big Bertha and the Brain. There's one other thing that I wanted to share with you quick today. It's something that I don't think this is a virtual event, but it was something that caught my attention. And it's a walking tour. It's called Buried Garden, a walking tour with Chris McCabe and Ian Sinclair. Now, Chris McCabe has this new book coming out. It's called Buried Garden, and I want to get it. And I think it's coming out Halloween. So we've got a little bit of time here. And you can pre-order it. It looks like a pre-order cost is about £10. But here's the description. It says, venture into the dense foliage of Abney Park Cemetery in the fourth installment of writer and literary detective Chris McCabe's project to unearth the lost poets of London's Victorian cemeteries, the Magnificent Seven. Doesn't that sound fascinating? And so this walking tour is of Abney Park Cemetery. And Chris is going to be sharing extracts from his book as he's going on this walking tour. But I will put a link to this in the Facebook group for the show on the off chance that you happen to be listening and you're near the Abney Park Cemetery and you want to go on this walking tour. I hope that they film this and get it on YouTube so that we can watch it later. But anyway, I thought it sounded really interesting. So there's that. All right, it's time for today's curated news. Well, it's that time of year again, which is why I picked today's article for curated news. This is an article from Better Homes and Gardens, and it's called 14 Tips for Planting Your Favorite Bulbs. So, have you gotten around to even getting your spring bulbs? I haven't even seen any posts about this in the Facebook group for the show. Usually, folks are sharing that. But even up here in Minnesota, it's been unseasonably warm for October. We're the middle of October and we just had an 80-degree day. So who's thinking about planting bulbs? But that can change on a dime. We can go from being 80 to 40 to 30 or lower. I don't even want to think about it. I did fortunately just call and got my sprinkler blowouts scheduled. So thank you, Northwest Landscape. They'll be coming later this week for Maple Grove, and then in a couple of weeks, they'll be up at the cabin. So I'm crossing my fingers that the weather's going to cooperate, but I digress. Now, when it comes to planting bulbs, you probably know that the biggest bang for your buck is probably to plant daffodils. And Vita Sackville West's tip that I just read on Twitter the other day was she said that she felt it was better to plant your bulbs in September than waiting way into October when things got cold. But of course, if you have to wait or you just end up waiting because you're just too busy or you don't get around to it, then by all means, plant them in October. But who knows? Maybe with climate change, October is the new September when it comes to planting bulbs. What do you think? Let me know your thoughts if you've gotten around to planting bulbs or when you prefer to plant your spring flowering bulbs. Now, this post from Better Homes and Gardens is pretty comprehensive. 14 tips. I'm not going to go through all of them right here, but I will just highlight a few of them just to kind of give you a little refresh on spring bulbs. We can sometimes forget and benefit from a little bit of a primer. One of the tips is to pick the right spot. I will say that when you're planting your bulbs, pay attention to the ground. If the ground is wet, if it's kind of a muddy or soupy area, if it's an area that in the spring is going to be flooding, or if it's an area where it just doesn't drain quickly, well, that's not a spot for bulbs because that's when they turn into little piles of mush and goo. So bulbs like to be planted in soil that drains quickly. And think about your garden. If you have an area that you've bermed up, that you've kind of hilled up, that can be a way that you can cheat and accomplish that quick draining effect because you've changed the elevation and that gravity will do the work for you. So consider that. I used to not have a berm on my property. And then after one of my dear friends, a neighbor, moved away, I decided to put a berm in between our two properties. It was either that or a fence, and I didn't want to go the fence route, so I did the berm route. But the best thing of all about having a berm is that I got that quick drainage. And I tell you what, that not only makes bulbs happy, that makes plants happy in general. How many times do we read about plants liking fast draining soil or well-drained soil? We hear that all the time. I was reading about Robin Lane Fox, the gardener, the other day, and he'd written a book on gardening. I can't remember which one it is, but he said in there, I should have called this well-drained soil or something like this, because apparently he found himself talking about that over and over and over again in his book. And so it just made me laugh. But keep that in mind when you're planting your bulbs. Think about that spot, well-draining soil, not kidding about that. And also should be plenty of sun. Most of these spring flowers want sun. So if you've got a shade garden and you just planted bulbs, go dig them up, stick them in a sunny spot, and your future spring self will thank you. Otherwise, you might be a little unhappy. If you ever have a tulip that doesn't bloom or a spring flowering bulb that just, you get the green, but you don't get the flower, that can be why. Need the sun. Okay, this next tip that I wanted to highlight here is called Make It Easy. Now, I'm going to do a little bit of a 180 here. I'm not going to talk about what they're talking about, which is planting bulbs in containers and how to make that work. Basically, all you do is put the bulbs in a container and then sink the container in the ground. That's not what I'm going to talk about. What I want to mention to you is that you can order your bulbs from Color Blends, because Tim over there has done a really good job of putting together combinations of spring flowering bulbs that really look good together. So you don't have to be a garden designer or a color composer or anything like that. You can just trust what's been put together in the Color Blends catalog. So if you haven't checked out Color Blends before, treat yourself and check it out. You can also use that catalog as a little bit of a design hack. If you're wondering about color combinations in your garden, well, see what you like over on the Color Blends catalog. That might help you narrow your palette down in your garden, and that's a good thing. All right, now this last tip is called naturalizing spring bulbs, and I love this. This is something I want to do up at the cabin because I know it'll be a wow. No one in the neighborhood is doing this. Everybody's doing the traditional daffodils, and of course, they're all growing in the garden where you'd expect them to grow or around the mailbox. That's always a nice thing. But this tip has to do with naturalizing your spring flowering bulbs, especially the super early ones, in your lawn. It's something different, and it is so cool when you actually see it happening. So here you're going to use bulbs like Siberian squill and snow crocus. The great thing about using those bulbs is they're tiny. They're not like the big fat daffodil bulbs or the tulip bulbs. You can also do snowdrops. So make sure that you're checking about growing zones, making sure that these are going to grow in your area. And finally, my last tip is not in this article, but it is something I talk to gardeners about all year, every year, ever since I became a gardener, and that is allium. The big, giant purple allium. Get more of them because every year when people come to your garden, what do they see? The allium. What gets commented about? The allium. You know, if there was a cheer for allium, it would be, what do we want? Allium. When do we want it? All year long, right? Snow, allium, what have you. But it is so true because whether you're talking to new gardeners or old gardeners or people who don't garden but just happen to visit gardens, alliums are a hit with everyone. They're a sure bet in the garden. So if you're putting your order in for spring bulbs, make sure to add alliums to the list. And don't you think that should be included in every single article on spring bulbs? I know, me too. All right, it's time for today's botanical history. Here's botanical history for today, October 11th. It was on this day, October 11th, in 1818, that the Philadelphia botanist Zaccheus Collins wrote to the botanist Jacob Bigelow in Boston. Zaccheus was a big-time plant collector. He had a large herbarium of most of the plants in the vicinity of Philadelphia, Greater Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. Now, Zaccheus never published anything, but he did correspond with the botanists of his time, and this is how we've gotten to know Zaccheus. Now, his favorite botanists to write to were Henry Muhlenberg, Frederick Muhlenberg, Stephen Eliot, and of course, Jacob Bigelow, the man that he wrote to on this day in 1818. Now, in this letter to Jacob, Zaccheus is giving him a little preview. He's giving him an idea of the plants that he is sending him on a ship named Hero. And what I've done to help with comprehension is to give you the common names of the plants that he was sending to Jacob. So here's what he wrote. The schooner Hero with Captain Daggett may be at Boston as soon as the present letter. On board is a little open box containing a growing plant of Virginia snakeroot, American ipecac, Bowman's root, and wild sweet potato vine. Quite the collection. And at this point, Zaccheus starts to talk about Bartram. He wrote, these were all put up under the direction of the worthy Mr. Bartram, my friend, still living at the old botanical gardens and home of the father of American botany. Pretty impressive, right? I thought so too. And then I love how he concluded this letter. He ended it by saying, "You will only have to pay the freight." So there you go. Shipping costs, still a problem today as they were back in 1818 for Jacob Bigelow. All right. And then it was on this day in 1825 that the German botanist Hermann Wendland was born. Hermann followed in the footsteps of his father and grandfather, who were both botanists, and served as the director of the Royal Gardens of Herrenhausen in Germany in Hanover. Now, each of these Wendland men, these generations of botanists, had their specialty. The grandfather worked with ericas or heathers. The father's focus was Philodendus acacias, acacias being primarily from Australia, and Hermann's love was the palm family or the Ericaceae family. And it was Hermann's monograph on palms that established how they should be classified. In fact, Hermann is remembered in the name for a South American palm genus, and it's called the Wendlandiella. Isn't that pretty? Now, during his life, Hermann turned Herrenhausen into the world's leading garden for palm cultivation and research. And in a short period of time, Herrenhausen's palm collection became unrivaled in the world. It was Hermann's focus on these stately and elegant trees that resulted in the construction of the tallest glass house in all of Europe. And that makes complete sense. If you're going to collect palm trees, you're going to need a very tall greenhouse. Now, in addition to naming over 500 palm species, Hermann named the Arizona palm. He called it the Washingtonia foliifera in memory of George Washington, which was very nice. But Hermann is also remembered for naming the genus St. Paulia, which is the African violet genus. And he named it after a fellow German botanist named Baron Walter von St. Paul. Now, in 1882, Baron Walter was the governor of the Usambara district in German East Africa. During his time there, he explored the Usambara Mountains that are located in the northeastern part of Tanzania. There, in the cloud forests, he collected seeds and specimens of a small herb that he sent home to Herrenhausen. And that's how Hermann got a hold of them. He immediately cultivated the little plants, and he recognized that they were an entirely new species in an entirely new genus. And so he named the plant St. Paulia ionantha. But today we call the plant by its common name, the African violet. Now, Hermann had another common name for the plant. He called it the Usambara Veilchen. And Veilchen is German for violet, so he was calling it the Usambara violet. But today we don't call them that. We just call them African violets, and they continue to be one of the most popular houseplants on the planet. But sadly, back at their home in their native Usambara Mountains, the plants today face extinction. Today is also the birthday of Arthur William Hill, the English botanist and taxonomist. He was born on this day, October 11th, in 1875. Arthur served as director of the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew. But before he became the director of Kew, he worked on a project for the Directorate of Graves Registration and Inquiries. This was the entity that was in charge of locating the graves of English service members who died during World War I. It was 1915 when Arthur became part of this project, and his role was to be the horticultural advisor. And the job required Arthur to visit all of these places where battles were fought throughout Europe and the Middle East. Anywhere the war was fought, Arthur visited, from France to Turkey, Italy to Palestine. And to give you an idea of just how crazy his travel schedule was, in 1916, during the month of March alone, Arthur visited 37 cemeteries. That's more than one a day. In 1917, Arthur visited the Somme battlefield in France, and he wrote poignantly about the poppies and the wildflowers that grew in the aftermath of the fighting that had occurred in the summer and fall of the previous year. Although the landscape was pockmarked from shells, Arthur wrote these words: "One saw only a vast expanse of weeds of cultivation, which so completely covered the ground and dominated the landscape that all appeared to be a level surface. In July, poppies predominated, and the sheet of color, as far as the eye could see, was superb, a blaze of scarlet, unbroken by tree or hedgerow. No more moving sight can be imagined than this great expanse of open country, gorgeous in its display of color, dotted over with half-hidden white crosses of the dead. In no British cemetery, large or small, however beautiful or impressive it may be, can the same sentiments be evoked or feelings so deeply stirred. Nowhere, I imagine, can the magnitude of the struggle be better appreciated than in this peaceful, poppy-covered battlefield, hallowed by its many scattered crosses." It's time for today's Unearthed Words. Today's Unearthed Words come to us from the American amateur gardener, Helena Rutherford Ely. This is an excerpt from her book, A Woman's Hardy Garden. After 5 or 6 years, I dig up my roses about October 10th, cut the tops down to about 12 inches, cut out some of the old wood, cut off the roots considerably, trench the ground anew, and replant. The following year, the roses may not bloom very profusely, but afterward, for 4 or 5 years, the yield will be great. My physician in the country is a fine gardener and particularly successful with roses, and we have many delightful talks about gardening. When I told him of my surgical operations upon the roses, he was horrified at such barbarity and seemed to listen with more or less incredulity. So I asked him if, as a surgeon as well as a physician, he approved on occasion of lopping off a patient's limbs to prolong his life, why he should not also sanction the same operation in the vegetable kingdom. He was silent. It's time to grow that garden library with today's book, Designing and Maintaining Your Edible Landscape Naturally by Robert Couric. This book came out in 1986, and in 2005, it was back in print by popular demand. Now, as per usual, Robert is ahead of the curve here. He's talking about incorporating edibles into the landscape, and he was doing this way back in the 80s. So props to Robert. Now, what I love about all of Robert Couric's books is how practical and experience-based his advice is. And as with his other books, He puts tons of resources at the end of this book as well, so make sure to check that out. Now, in this book, Robert especially focuses on the edible plants that you can put in your garden that will not only help fertilize the soil, but will also attract beneficial insects like pollinators and then provide additional benefits like helping your garden with issues like erosion or sheltering your home from cold, heat, and wind. Robert also talks about how to incorporate edibles in trouble spots. So think about areas where water is a problem or where you maybe don't get that much sun. Well, Robert guides you through all of that and makes edible suggestions for those areas as well. In this book, Robert also talks about making your soil better. He walks you through a ton of tree pruning styles, and he even dishes up some gourmet recipes because, of course, if you're growing edibles, you're going to want to eat them. That's the best part. This book is 382 pages of edible landscaping from a master. Robert installed his very first edible landscape back in 1978, and he brings all of that experience to bear in this fantastic resource. You can get a copy of Designing and Maintaining Your Edible Landscape Naturally by Robert Couric and support the show using the Amazon link in today's show notes for around $18. Finally, here's something sweet to revive the little botanic spark in your heart. It was on this day, October 11th in 1926, that Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Buddhist monk, naturalist, writer, and peace activist, was born. His students call him Thai or Tay, which is Vietnamese for teacher. In 1982, Thai co-founded the Plum Village, a Buddhist monastery in southern France. Thai often uses nature to teach. In 2014, he wrote No Mud, No Lotus, The Art of Transforming Suffering. And he once wrote, Wilting flowers do not cause suffering. It's the unrealistic desire that flowers not wilt that causes suffering. And in his 2011 book called Fidelity, How to Create a Loving Relationship That Lasts, Thai wrote these words: Every time you breathe in and know you are breathing, every time you breathe out and smile to your out-breath, you are yourself. You are your own master, and you are the gardener of your own garden. Finally, in his 1992 book, Peace is Every Step, The Path of Mindfulness in Everyday Life, Thai wrote these words that I wanted to end the show with today. And I picked this out of so many quotes that Thai has written about that are garden related or nature related, but this one spoke to me especially. He wrote, I have lost my smile, but don't worry, the dandelion has it. Thanks for listening to The Daily Gardener. And remember, for a happy, healthy life, garden every day. The Daily Gardener is produced in lovely Maple Grove and Wyoming, Minnesota. If you want to read today's show notes, just head on over to thedailygardener.org. And while you're there, be sure to sign up for my free Friday newsletter. And don't forget that you have a standing invitation to join the free Facebook group for listeners of the show. Just search for Daily Gardener Community the next time you're on Facebook and request to join. Last but not least, you can always get in touch by emailing me at jennifer@thedailygardener.org. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling, and as always, have a great day in the garden, and we'll see you tomorrow.